Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the mists of ancient legend. Tonight we venture into the frozen halls of Asgard, into a world of ravens and wolves, of sacrifice and wisdom, of thunder and prophecy. We're going to explore one of the most complex, fascinating, and enigmatic figures in all of world mythology. The god who gave his eye for wisdom, who hanged himself from the world tree for 9 nights to unlock cosmic secrets, who commands the dead and rides an 8-legged horse across the sky. Tonight we're going to talk about Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed wanderer, the god of war, death, poetry, and runes. Before you settle in, take a moment to grab your favorite blanket, dim the lights, maybe light a candle if that helps you relax. And if you enjoy these deep dives into mythology, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. Now let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see our community spread across the world. Let's begin. In the pantheon of Norse gods, no figure looms larger or casts a longer shadow than Odin. Where other gods might be defined by a single role or purpose, Odin defies simple categorization. He is not merely a sky god or a war god or a death god. He is all of these and more, a deity whose very nature seems to contain multitudes, contradictions, paradoxes. The Greeks had Zeus, the Romans had Jupiter, but the Norse had Odin, and he was something altogether different from those thunder-wielding kings of heaven. To truly understand Odin, we must first recognize that he was known by many names. Not just nicknames or epithets, but names that each revealed a different facet of his complex character. The ancient texts record over 170 names for Odin, each one a window into how the Norse people understood this multifaceted deity. He was called Allfather, Allfather, the father of all the gods and of humanity itself. But he was also Grimnir, the hooded one, the masked wanderer who concealed his true identity beneath disguises. Har, Jafnhar, and Thridi, the High One, the Equally High, and the Third, names used when he appeared in triple form to test seekers of wisdom. Bolverk, the worker of misfortune or evildoer, a name he took when he went in disguise to steal the mead of poetry from the giants. Gangleri and Ganglari, the wanderer and way-weary, names reflecting his endless journeys across the 9 realms in search of knowledge. These were not empty titles, but revelations of character, each name a facet of the complicated jewel that was Odin's nature. To know his names was to begin to understand his complexity, to recognize that he could not be reduced to a single role or simple archetype. He was everything and its opposite, wise and treacherous, generous and withholding, creator and destroyer, the god who embodied the fundamental paradoxes of existence itself. His most common name in Old Norse was Odin, though in other Germanic languages he appeared as Woden in Old English, Wotan in Old High German, and Woden in Old Saxon. The name itself derives from a powerful Old Norse word, Oder, which carries meanings of fury, ecstasy, inspiration, and divine madness. Add to this the masculine definite article suffix, and Odin's name essentially means master of ecstasy, or the furious one. This etymology is crucial because it reveals something fundamental about Odin's nature. He was not a god of calm reason or orderly civilization. He was the god of that electric moment when inspiration strikes, when battle rage overtakes a warrior, when the poet finds words that seem to come from beyond themselves. Odin was the embodiment of that raw, transformative energy that the Vikings called Oder, that state of consciousness that transcends the ordinary and touches the divine. The 11th century historian Adam of Bremen, writing from a Christian perspective but recording what he learned about the pagan Norse, confirmed this when he translated Odin's name as the Furious One. This was a god whose very essence was tied to states of heightened consciousness, to moments of transformation and transcendence. Whether that ecstasy came through poetry, through battle, through magic, or through sacrifice, Odin was its patron and its embodiment. But Odin was also a god of paradox. He was called Allfather, suggesting a benevolent patriarch. Yet he was known to be fickle, to withdraw his favor from warriors in the midst of battle, to value his own mysterious purposes above loyalty or justice. He was a god of wisdom, yet he achieved that wisdom through means that would be considered shameful by Norse standards, practicing magic that was traditionally the domain of women. He was a war god, But unlike his straightforward son Thor, Odin's approach to conflict was subtle, cunning, manipulative. He didn't win through raw strength, but through trickery, strategy, and the manipulation of fate itself. This complexity made Odin both revered and feared. Kings and chieftains claimed descent from him, seeking to legitimize their rule through divine lineage. Warriors invoked his name before battle, hoping to be chosen as one of his einherjar, his honored dead who would feast in Valhalla. Yet people also knew Odin as the Oathbreaker, the deceiver, the god who might promise victory and then change his mind at the last moment for reasons known only to himself. To understand Odin fully, we need to trace his story from the very beginning, from the moment when the cosmos itself was still taking shape, from chaos and void to the structured world of the 9 realms. Long before Asgard rose into the sky, before the first human drew breath, before even the sun and moon were set in their courses, there was the void called Ginnungagap. This was not empty space as we understand it, but something more primal, a yawning chasm between realms of fire and ice. To the south burned Muspelheim, a realm of flame and heat. To the north lay Niflheim, a world of ice and frozen mist. Where the heat of Muspelheim met the cold of Niflheim, the ice began to melt, and from those primordial waters came the first being, the giant Ymir. Ymir was not a god, but a primordial force, and from him came more giants, beings of frost and stone. At the same time, the melting ice revealed another being, licked free from the rime by the cosmic cow Audumla. This was Buri, the first of what would become the Aesir gods. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor took as his wife Bestla, a giantess, daughter of the giant Bolthorn. This union between god and giant was significant, for it meant that the divine blood of the Aesir would always carry within it the wild, untamed nature of the giants. From Bor and Bestla came 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These 3 brothers would become the architects of the world as the Norse knew it, but to create, they first had to destroy. Ymir and his giant kin were growing numerous and powerful, and the 3 brothers saw in them a threat to any ordered cosmos. So Odin, Vili, and Ve attacked Ymir and slew him. The primordial giant's death was cataclysmic. So much blood poured from his body that it drowned all the other frost giants, save 2, Bergelmir and his wife, who escaped in a boat and would go on to repopulate the race of giants. But the 3 brothers were not finished. In an act of cosmic creation through destruction, they took Ymir's immense corpse and from it fashioned the world. His flesh became the earth, rich and fertile. His blood became the seas and lakes that surrounded and filled the land. His bones were broken and shaped into mountains. His teeth and fragments of shattered bone became stones and boulders scattered across the landscape. His skull was lifted high to form the dome of the sky, held aloft at 4 points by 4 dwarves. His brains were scattered into the air and became the clouds. Even his eyebrows found purpose, formed into a protective wall around Midgard, the realm that would one day house humanity. But the cosmos needed more than just physical structure. The 3 brothers caught sparks flying from Muspelheim and set them in the sky as stars. They captured the greatest of these sparks and made them into the sun and moon, setting them on chariots to race across the heavens, forever pursued by the wolves Skoll and Hati, who would one day catch and devour them at Ragnarok. With the physical world established, Odin and his brothers turned their attention to populating it. Walking along the seashore one day, they found 2 trees. One was certainly an ash tree, from which came Ask, whose name means precisely that. The other was likely an elm, though scholars debate this, from which came Embla. From these lifeless forms, they fashioned the first humans. Different sources tell this story with some variation in the details, but the essence remains constant. The 3 gods gave these wooden forms what they needed to become truly human. One gave them breath and spirit, the vital force that animated their bodies. Another gave them consciousness, intelligence, and the ability to move. The third gave them their senses, the ability to speak and hear and see, along with their distinctive features and appearance. They named the man Ask and the woman Embla, and from these 2, all of humanity would descend. With the world created and humanity given life, Odin and his kin established Asgard as their realm, a magnificent fortress city connected to Midgard by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost. But to understand Odin's place in the cosmos, we must understand Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree that stood at the center of all existence, that held the 9 realms in its branches and roots. Yggdrasil was no ordinary tree, though it took that form. It was the axis of the universe, the spine upon which all reality was structured. Its trunk was wider than mountains, its bark carved with runes of power placed there by the Norns. Its branches stretched upward beyond sight, reaching into the heavens themselves and out across space, creating the framework upon which the different realms hung like ornaments on a cosmic tree. The 9 realms, each distinct in character and population, found their place in this great structure. At the highest point sat Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, a realm of golden halls and mighty fortresses where Odin ruled from his throne. Below and around it hung Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, those gods of fertility and natural magic who had once warred with the Aesir before peace was made. Alfheim, realm of the light elves, those beautiful and luminous beings who some said were barely distinguishable from gods themselves. At the middle level, connected to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost that shimmered with all the colors of light, lay Midgard, the middle realm, the world of humans. It was encircled by a vast ocean, and in that ocean dwelt the great serpent, Jormungandr, so large that it wrapped entirely around the world and held its own tail in its jaws. Beyond Midgard in the branches hung Jotunheim, the land of the giants, a realm of stone and ice and ancient grudges. Here dwelt the frost giants and mountain giants, the eternal enemies of the gods, though their blood mixed with that of the Aesir through frequent intermarriage. Deeper still, in the darker parts of the tree lay Svartalfheim, home of the dark elves or dwarves, master craftsmen who forged magical objects in their underground halls. Some accounts placed this realm beneath the earth, others among the roots of Yggdrasil, but all agreed that the dwarves who lived there were masters of craft, beyond any mortal skill. They had forged Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, the magical ship Skidbladnir, and countless other treasures of the gods. At the roots, in the deepest and coldest places, lay Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist from which the first beginnings had emerged. Here was the dragon Nidhogg, gnawing eternally at the roots of Yggdrasil, trying to bring down the world tree and with it all of creation. And here too, or perhaps overlapping with Niflheim in the dark places, was Helheim, the realm of Hel, daughter of Loki, where those who died of sickness or old age went to dwell in shadow. And finally there was Muspelheim, the realm of fire, home to the fire giants and their lord Surtur, that ancient being who had existed since before creation and who would, at Ragnarok, lead the fire giants to burn down the world. Muspelheim existed at the opposite extreme from Niflheim, not cold but unbearably hot, not dark but blazing with eternal flame. These 9 realms, held in the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, composed the Norse cosmos, and Yggdrasil itself was a living being, though of a kind beyond mortal comprehension. At its base lay 3 wells. One was Hvergelmir, the roaring kettle, from which flowed rivers both mundane and magical. Another was Mimisbrunner, the well of Mimir that held wisdom and knowledge. The third was Urd's well, where the Norns dwelt and carved the fates of all beings into the tree's trunk in the form of runes. The tree was constantly under assault. The dragon Nidhogg gnawed at its roots from below. 4 stags, Dain, Dvalin, Dunir, and Durathror, wandered among its branches, eating the leaves and shoots. The tree dripped dew that the stags drank, and this dew was said to be the source of all the world's rivers. An eagle perched at the very top of the tree, and between its eyes sat a hawk named Veidrfolnir. The eagle and the dragon Nidhogg despised each other, and a squirrel named Ratatosk ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults between them, stirring up their ancient enmity. Despite these assaults, Yggdrasil endured. The Norns tended it, drawing water from Urd's well and mixing it with the mud around the well's banks to create a mixture they plastered onto the trunk, preserving it against decay. The tree was the spine of reality itself, and as long as it stood, the cosmos would endure. But it would not stand forever. At Ragnarok, when the final battle came, Yggdrasil would shake and tremble, And though the sources do not explicitly say it would fall, the implication was clear. When the tree failed, all the realms it supported would fall with it. This was the framework in which Odin existed and ruled. From his hall in Asgard, perched high in the branches of Yggdrasil, he could look out across all the realms. He was king of the gods, yes, but more than that, he was a figure who moved between worlds, who understood the connections between them, who traveled the branches of the world tree seeking wisdom wherever it might be found, in whatever realm it might be hidden. And it was this hunger that would lead him to his first great sacrifice. At the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that connected all 9 realms of Norse cosmology, there lay a well. Not an ordinary well, but Mimir's the well of wisdom, guarded by a being named Mimir. Mimir was no ordinary guardian. He was a figure of immense age and knowledge, possibly a giant, possibly something older still. Some accounts say he was Odin's uncle, maternal kin through Bestla's line. What was certain was that Mimir possessed wisdom beyond that of any of the gods, and the source of this wisdom was the well he guarded. The waters of Mimir's were not ordinary water. They contained within them knowledge of all things, past, present, and future. They held the secrets of the runes, understanding of fate, comprehension of the intricate workings of the cosmos. Anyone who drank from this well would gain insight beyond mortal or even divine understanding, but Mimir did not grant access to this wisdom freely or lightly. He knew its value, knew its weight, and knew that such knowledge came at a terrible price. Odin, despite being king of the gods and creator of the world, recognized that his knowledge was limited. He could see much from his high seat Hlidskjalf in Asgard, from which he surveyed all the 9 realms. He had his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew across the worlds each day and returned to whisper news in his ears. But this was surface knowledge, the knowledge of what is and what appears to be. Odin craved something deeper. He wanted to understand the why beneath the what, to peer into the hidden mechanisms of fate and destiny, to know not just what would happen, but why it must happen. And so Odin journeyed to Mimir's. He descended from Asgard, traveling along the roots of Yggdrasil into realms where even gods did not often venture. He came at last to the well, that dark pool of wisdom guarded by ancient Mimir, and he asked for a drink. Mimir looked at the Allfather, king of the Aesir, and did not simply grant his request. Wisdom, true wisdom, cannot be given freely. It must be earned, must be paid for with sacrifice commensurate to its value. And so Mimir named his price, an eye. Not just any tribute, but a part of Odin himself, a sacrifice that would mark him forever, that would change how he saw the world in the most literal sense. The sources do not record Odin hesitating. Perhaps he weighed the cost for a moment, considering what it would mean to give up half his sight, to forever after see the world with just one eye. Perhaps he simply knew immediately that any price was worth paying for the wisdom he sought. What the sources do tell us is that Odin reached up, plucked out his own eye, and dropped it into the well. Imagine that moment. The sharp, searing pain, the blood, the immediate profound change in vision, the loss of depth perception, the narrowing of the visual field. And yet, in exchange, as Mimir dipped his horn, the Gjallarhorn, into the well and offered Odin a drink, the Allfather gained something far more valuable than physical sight. He gained wisdom, not the accumulation of facts or the memory of experiences, but deep, penetrating understanding. He gained knowledge of the workings of fate, glimpses of what was to come, including the terrible knowledge of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the day when he himself would fall. He learned the nature of the runes, though he would need to undergo another ordeal to truly master them. He understood the intricate web of cause and effect that bound all things together, the pattern that underlay the apparent chaos of existence. But the price was permanent and visible. From that day forward, Odin was the one-eyed god. Often he would disguise this when he walked among mortals, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his face, or appearing as an old man with one eye clouded or damaged. But among the gods, his missing eye was a constant reminder of his dedication to wisdom, of his willingness to sacrifice anything, even parts of himself, for knowledge. Some scholars have interpreted this sacrifice as more than just a physical loss. The eye that Odin gave up represented one mode of perception, the surface sight that sees only what appears. By trading this external sight for the waters of wisdom, Odin exchanged the profane way of seeing for a sacred one. He sacrificed ordinary perception for extraordinary understanding. Where before he saw with two eyes like any being, now he saw with one physical eye and one inner eye of wisdom, able to perceive not just the surface of things but their deeper truth. Mimir's name itself is significant. It means the rememberer, and it suggests that the wisdom he guarded was not just knowledge of present or future, but deep understanding of the past, of ancestral wisdom, of the traditions and patterns that had governed existence since the beginning. By drinking from Mimir's well, Odin connected himself to this ancient wisdom, this understanding that came not from innovation, but from deep memory of how things had always been. But Mimir's story did not end at his well. There came a time when war broke out between two tribes of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, and Mimir became tragically caught in the consequences of that conflict. The Vanir were gods of a different kind than the Aesir. Where the Aesir represented power, war, rule, and order, the Vanir embodied fertility, prosperity, natural magic, and the wild abundance of the earth. They were led by Njord, god of the sea and seafaring, and his children Freyr and Freya, deities of fertility and erotic love. The Vanir had their own realm, Vanaheim, and their own ways of practicing magic, particularly cider, that art of trance and prophecy that Odin would later learn. The war between the Aesir and Vanir broke out for reasons the sources do not make entirely clear. Some say it began when the Vanir sent a witch named Gullveig to Asgard, and the Aesir, disturbed by her magic, tried 3 times to burn her to death, but each time she rose from the flames reborn. The Vanir took this as an insult and a declaration of war. Others suggest the conflict arose from fundamental differences in nature between the two groups of gods, an inevitable clash between different principles of divine power. Whatever its cause, the war raged across the realms. The Aesir were fierce warriors, but the Vanir had their own magic and power. Battles were fought, fortifications were razed and destroyed, and neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Eventually, both sides grew weary of the endless conflict and agreed to negotiate a peace. As was customary in Norse culture, the peace treaty included an exchange of hostages. High-ranking members of each group sent to live with the former enemy as a guarantee of good faith. The Aesir sent Honir, described as tall and handsome, and Mimir, the wisest of their number, to live among the Vanir. In return, the Vanir sent Njord and his children, Freyr and Freya, to dwell in Asgard. At first, the arrangement seemed promising. Honir was impressive in appearance and bearing, and with Mimir at his side to whisper counsel, he seemed wise and thoughtful. But the Vanir gradually realized something was wrong. Whenever important decisions needed to be made, whenever Honir was called upon to judge disputes or offer advice, he would defer to Mimir. And if Mimir was not present, Honir would simply say, "Let others decide," offering no opinion of his own. The Vanir came to believe they had been cheated in the exchange. They had sent away their greatest gods, Njord, Freyr, and Freya, and in return received one god who was useless without his counselor. In their anger and feeling of betrayal, they took a terrible revenge. They beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Odin in Asgard. The loss of Mimir might have reignited the war, but Odin would not allow his friend's wisdom to be lost. He took Mimir's severed head and worked powerful magic upon it. He embalmed it with special herbs to prevent decay. He spoke charms and incantations over it, ancient words of power. And through this magic he reanimated the head, gave it the power of speech, preserved within it all the vast wisdom that Mimir had accumulated over ages beyond counting. Odin placed Mimir's preserved head by the well, Mimisbrunner, the well from which Mimir had once drawn his wisdom. And from that day forward, whenever Odin needed counsel on matters of the deepest importance, whenever he faced decisions that would shape the fate of gods and worlds, he would journey to the well and consult with Mimir's head. The ancient being would speak, his wisdom undiminished by death, offering guidance that only one who had drunk from the well of wisdom and now existed in that liminal state between life and death could provide. The sources tell us that at the beginning of Ragnarok, when the final battle was about to commence, one of Odin's first acts would be to ride to Mimir's Brunner to consult Mimir's head one last time, seeking any final wisdom that might help in the confrontation to come. Even knowing that fate could not be changed, Odin would seek understanding until the very end. This episode revealed much about Odin's character. He would not accept loss passively. When Mimir was killed, Odin found a way to preserve his wisdom. When faced with the limitations of death, he used magic to transcend them. And he understood something profound about wisdom, that it was not bound to living bodies, that knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across the boundary that separated the living from the dead. This understanding would serve him well in his next great ordeal, when he would deliberately place himself in that boundary state to gain mastery of an even greater power. The sacrifice at Mimir's well was Odin's first great ordeal in pursuit of knowledge, but it would not be his last, for there was another source of wisdom, another mystery that called to him, and to unlock it would require an even more harrowing sacrifice. If Odin's sacrifice of his eye was a permanent physical loss, his next ordeal was a temporary but total sacrifice, a voluntary descent into the space between life and death that would last 9 days and 9 nights. At the roots of Yggdrasil, in the murky waters of the Well of Urd, there dwelt the Norns, 3 female beings who controlled the fate of all things, gods and mortals alike. Their names were Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, representing past, present, and future. These were not goddesses subject to Odin's rule, but primordial forces that existed before the gods and would exist after them. Even Odin, powerful as he was, could not command the Norns. He could not change the fates they wove. But the Norns worked with tools that fascinated Odin. They carved their fates using runes, ancient symbols that were far more than just an alphabet. Each rune was a cosmic force, a fundamental power that shaped reality itself. The word rune in Old Norse meant both letter and secret or mystery, because the runes were not simply a writing system, but a magical toolkit, a way of accessing and manipulating the deepest forces of existence. Odin's quest for wisdom never ceased. He had sacrificed an eye for the waters of Mimir's well, gaining vast knowledge of past, present, and future. But there was more to know, more power to obtain. The runes existed, carved by the Norns into the roots of Yggdrasil itself. But knowledge of their existence was not the same as mastery of their use. The runes would not reveal themselves to just anyone. They could not be stolen or learned through study alone. They demanded proof of worthiness, demanded a sacrifice so profound that only someone willing to give everything would be granted their secrets. And so Odin decided to undergo what shamans throughout history have called an initiatory ordeal, a ritual death and rebirth that would transform him fundamentally and grant him access to hidden knowledge. He chose Yggdrasil itself as the site of his ordeal. The great world tree stood at the center of the cosmos, its branches stretching into the heavens, its roots delving into the deepest wells of power. Odin climbed into the branches of Yggdrasil, and there he performed an act that even by the standards of Norse mythology seems almost incomprehensibly harsh. He stabbed himself with his own spear, Gungnir. The wound was not meant to kill quickly, but to cause pain and blood loss, a wound that would slowly drain life but allow consciousness to remain. Then he fashioned a noose and hanged himself from a branch. Not a quick hanging meant to break the neck, but a suspension, his body weight supported by the rope, cutting off breath slowly, creating that liminal state between life and death. But even this physical ordeal was not enough. Odin forbade any of the other gods from offering him aid. No food was to be brought to him, no water, no comfort. He was to hang there, wounded, starving, dehydrating, for 9 days and 9 nights, staring down into the waters of the Well of Urd, where the Norns carved their runes, calling out to the runes themselves, demanding that they reveal themselves to one who had proven himself worthy through the ultimate sacrifice. The number 9 was sacred in Norse cosmology. There were 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil. Odin's ordeal of 9 days and nights was thus a complete cycle, a full journey through all the phases of transformation. The first days would have been agonizing, but bearable. The wound from Gungnir would have burned and bled. The rope would have chafed and cut into his neck. Hunger, and especially thirst, would have begun to torment him, but he would have retained his full consciousness, his full awareness of the pain. As the days wore on, things would have changed. The body begins to shut down when deprived of food and water, when wounded and left without treatment. Odin would have experienced fever, delirium, hallucinations. His vision would have blurred. His thoughts would have fragmented. The line between waking and dreaming, between consciousness and unconsciousness, would have dissolved. This was precisely the state he was seeking, this liminal space where the ordinary rules no longer applied, where the barriers between worlds grew thin. The ancient poem Havamal, part of the Poetic Edda, records Odin's own words about this ordeal. He speaks in the first person, describing how he hung on that wind-swept tree, pierced by a spear, given to Odin, myself to myself. This phrase is crucial. Odin sacrificed himself to himself. He was both the one who offered the sacrifice and the one who received it. He was priest and offering, killer and victim. This was not a sacrifice made to appease another god or to bargain for favor. This was something deeper, a willing destruction of the lower self to allow the higher self to emerge, a ritual death that would lead to rebirth in a transformed state. The poem continues, describing how no one gave him bread or drink, how he peered down into the depths, how at last, screaming, he took up the runes. On the 9th day, at the very edge of death, his consciousness expanded or contracted to a point where ordinary reality dissolved. And in that moment, the shapes in the water became clear. The runes revealed themselves, not just their forms, but their meanings, their powers, their uses. He saw Fehu, the rune of wealth and cattle, of mobile power; Urus, the rune of the aurochs, of raw strength and vitality; Thurisaz, the thorn, the giant, the force of chaos and disruption; Ansuz, the rune of the Aesir, of divine inspiration and communication; Raido, the rune of the wagon wheel, of journeys and right action; and on through the Elder Futhark, the oldest form of the runic alphabet, 24 runes in total, each one a key to a different aspect of cosmic power. But the runes were not just symbols to be memorized. With them came songs, spells, charms. Odin learned 9 songs of power, taught to him by what the sources describe as a relative from his mother's side, possibly referring to Mimir, who may have been his maternal uncle, or to others among his giant kin. These songs gave him the power to heal wounds of body and spirit, to free himself from bindings, to calm storms, to turn aside weapons, to wake the dead and compel them to speak, to win and keep love, to protect companions in battle. He learned 18 charms, magical formulas that would allow him to manipulate reality through the power of the runes. These included the ability to blunt enemy weapons, to break chains, to stop arrows in mid-flight, to extinguish fires, to banish workers of harmful magic, to shield friends from harm in combat, to prevent quarrels, to stop hail and wind, to calm the sea, to identify and expel thieves and robbers, to gain the love of another, to ease childbirth, and to perform many other feats that demonstrated mastery over the fundamental forces that shaped the world. Having gained this knowledge, having passed through death and returned, Odin screamed with the exultation of victory. He tore himself free from the tree, though the sources do not say how, whether he cut the rope or pulled himself free, or simply willed the ordeal to end now that its purpose was accomplished. He emerged from his 9-day ordeal fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a god of war or a creator deity. He had become something more, a shamanic figure who had journeyed to the edge of death and returned with secret knowledge, a master of the runes who could now reshape fate itself. The parallels to shamanic initiation rituals from around the world are striking. In many cultures, shamans undergo ordeals that involve isolation, fasting, physical pain, and altered states of consciousness, emerging with the ability to journey between worlds, to heal, to divine the future, to speak with spirits. Odin's ordeal on Yggdrasil follows this pattern perfectly, marking him as not just a god, but a divine shaman, one who had mastered the techniques of altered consciousness and could use them to access hidden knowledge and power. But knowledge and power, as Odin well knew, were not ends in themselves. They were means to an end, and for Odin that end was preparation. Because the wisdom he had gained from Mimir's well had shown him the future, had revealed to him the coming of Ragnarok, the day when the gods would fall and the world would burn. And Odin knew that when that day came, he would need warriors, an army of the dead, the finest fighters who had ever lived. He would need the einherjar. When a Viking warrior fell in battle, where did their soul go? The answer depended on who was watching. The Norse afterlife was not a simple place, not a single heaven or hell, but a complex landscape with multiple destinations. Some of the dead went to Hel, the realm ruled by the goddess of the same name, daughter of Loki. This was not a place of punishment, but simply the destination for those who died of old age or sickness, a shadowy realm where the dead lived a kind of echo of their mortal existence. But for those who died in battle, for warriors who fell with weapons in hand, there were other possibilities. Some would be claimed by Freya, the beautiful goddess of love and war, who would take them to her hall Folkvanger, the field of the host. But the most honored, the bravest and most skilled, would be chosen by Odin himself to join the einherjar, the honored dead who would dwell in Valhalla, the hall of the slain. Valhalla was Odin's great hall in Asgard, and it was built for war. The sources describe it as enormous, with 540 doors so wide that 800 warriors could march through each one side by side. Its roof was thatched with golden shields that reflected the light of the sun. Its rafters were made of spears. Mail coats were strewn about like cushions. A wolf hung before the western door, and an eagle soared above, constant reminders of the predatory nature of war. But Odin did not personally scour the battlefields for worthy warriors. For this task, he had created the Valkyries, whose name meant choosers of the slain. These were female spirits, warrior maidens who served Odin's purposes. Some sources describe them as his daughters, or as goddesses in their own right. Others portrayed them as supernatural beings between goddesses and spirits. What was consistent was their role and their power. The Valkyries rode through the sky on flying horses or wolves, arriving at battlefields where conflict raged. They were described as wearing armor, carrying spears and shields, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Their very presence on the battlefield could determine the outcome of combat, because the Valkyries did not merely observe. They chose. They decided who would live and who would die, who would fall, and who would stand victorious. This decision was made according to Odin's will, because the Allfather had his own interests in the outcomes of human wars, his own need for particular warriors to join his host. When a warrior the Valkyries had chosen fell in battle, his soul was lifted up by these divine maidens and carried to Valhalla. The journey was not described in detail in the sources, but we can imagine it as a flight through the air, the fallen warrior's spirit borne up by these fierce and beautiful beings, leaving behind the blood and chaos of the battlefield for the glory that awaited in Odin's hall. Upon arrival in Valhalla, the dead warrior discovered that his death was not an end but a transformation. He became one of the einherjar, a word that can be translated as army of one, or those who fight alone, though paradoxically they formed a great host. In Valhalla, the einherjar lived a life that to the Viking mind represented the perfect existence. Each day they rose early and prepared for battle. They armed themselves with weapons that never dulled and donned armor that never broke. Then they went out to the fields around Valhalla and fought. Not grudge matches or duels, but massive, joyous battles where every warrior could test their skill against the greatest fighters who had ever lived. They fought without holding back, without fear, because death was no longer permanent. When a warrior fell in these practice battles, when he was hacked to pieces or run through with a sword, he did not truly die. At the approach of evening, all the wounds healed, the dead rose again, and the warriors returned to Valhalla whole and unharmed. The evening brought the feast. The einherjar would gather in the great hall, and there they were served by the Valkyries, the same maidens who had chosen them in death, now bringing them food and drink. The drink was mead, but not ordinary mead. It flowed endlessly from the udders of a goat named Hydron, who stood on the roof of Valhalla, feeding on the leaves of a tree that may have been Yggdrasil itself or one of its manifestations. The mead never ran out, and every warrior could drink his fill without ever becoming too drunk to enjoy the feast. The food was even more remarkable. Every evening a magical boar named Sehrimnir was slaughtered and cooked by the chef Andrimnir in an enormous cauldron called Eldrimnir. The meat from this boar could feed all the countless thousands of warriors in Valhalla, and every warrior could eat as much as he wanted. But here was the miracle. When morning came, Sehrimnir was alive again, whole and healthy, ready to be slaughtered once more that evening. The feast could continue forever, night after night, with no fear of the food running out. The sources mention that Odin himself sat at the high table during these feasts, but they also note something curious. Odin did not eat. He gave his portions of meat to his two wolves, Geri and Freki, whose names both meant greedy or ravenous. Odin sustained himself on wine alone, on the poetry and wisdom shared at the feast, and on his own divine nature, which needed no mortal sustenance. For the Einherjar, this existence represented heaven. They trained with the greatest warriors in history. They feasted every night on the finest food and drink. They were attended by beautiful Valkyries. Some sources even suggest that einherjar could take Valkyries as wives, forming bonds that transcended the boundary between life and death. It was an existence of eternal glory, camaraderie, honor, and pleasure. But it was not meant to last forever. The einherjar were not being collected for their own enjoyment. They were being prepared, trained, readied for a specific purpose. Odin was building an army, the greatest army ever assembled, because his wisdom had shown him what was coming. He knew that one day the forces of chaos would break free, that the giants would march, that Loki's monstrous children would escape their bonds, and that the final battle, Ragnarok, would come. And when it did, Odin would need every warrior he could muster. The prophecy of Ragnarok hung over everything in Norse mythology like a shadow, like a storm building on the horizon. Odin, through his wisdom gained at such terrible cost, knew more of it than any other being. He knew that despite all his power, despite his cunning, despite his armies and his magic, Ragnarok could not be prevented. Fate, as woven by the Norns, was inexorable. The best he could do was prepare, gather his forces, and face the inevitable end with as much strength and courage as possible. From his high seat, Hlidskjalf, Odin watched the world. He sent out his ravens each morning to fly across all 9 realms and return with news. He consulted with seers and prophetesses, including traveling to Hell itself to wake a dead Völva, a seeress, to question her about the future. He studied the runes, reading in them the patterns of fate, and everything confirmed what he already knew. The end was coming. The signs would be unmistakable. First would come the Fimbul winter. 3 successive winters with no summer between them. Snow would fall continuously, frost would grip the land, and the cold would be so severe that families would turn against each other, that all social bonds would break down, that brother would fight brother and father would slay son. Moral order would collapse utterly. During this endless winter, the wolves that chased the sun and moon across the sky would finally catch their prey. Skoll would devour the sun, Hati would swallow the moon, and the world would be plunged into darkness. The stars themselves would fall from the sky, and the earth would shake with terrible earthquakes. These quakes would break chains that had held for ages. Loki, bound to a rock as punishment for causing the death of Baldur, would feel his bonds snap. The great wolf Fenrir, son of Loki, chained with magical fetters since he was young, would break free at last. The serpent Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircled Midgard with his body, would thrash and rise from the sea, causing tidal waves to swamp the land. And then would come the armies. Loki would lead the giants from Jotunheim, sailing in a ship made from the fingernails of the dead. Surtur, the fire giant, would march from Muspelheim, his sword burning brighter than the sun itself, leading his fire giants to war. Hel would open the gates of her realm and release the dead, a legion of dishonored ghosts to march alongside the giants. And Fenrir would race across the land, his jaws gaping so wide that his upper jaw touched the sky while his lower jaw scraped the earth, ready to devour everything in his path. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, would stand at the Bifrost Bridge and blow his horn Gjallarhorn, the same horn that Mimir had once used to draw water from his well. The sound would echo across all 9 realms, a call to arms, the final summons. Every god would hear it. Every einherji in Valhalla would hear it, and they would know that the moment had come. Odin would don his golden armor and his finest helmet. He would take up Gungnir, his spear that never missed its mark. He would mount Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, swifter than any normal steed. And he would ride out to the field of Vigrid, the vast plain where the final battle would take place. Behind him would ride all the gods of Asgard and all the einherjar from Valhalla, 800 warriors pouring through each of 540 doors, an army of hundreds of thousands of the finest fighters who had ever lived. But it would not be enough. The prophecy was clear on this point. The gods would fight valiantly, would perform deeds of amazing heroism, but they would fall one by one. Thor would slay Jormungandr, but die from the serpent's venom, managing only 9 steps after his victory before collapsing dead. Tyr would battle Garm, the Hound of Hell, and kill the beast, but not before receiving a mortal wound himself. Heimdall and Loki would fight each other, and both would fall. Freyr would face Surtur without his sword, which he had given away long ago, and the fire giant would cut him down. And Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed wanderer, the god who had sacrificed so much for wisdom, would face Fenrir. The monstrous wolf, son of Loki, would charge at the king of the gods. Odin would thrust at him with Gungnir, would command the einherjar to attack, but it would make no difference. Fenrir's jaws would close around Odin, and the Allfather would be swallowed whole, devoured by the beast he had once tried to bind. But even in death, Odin would be avenged. His son Vidar, who had been silent throughout all the battles of the gods, would step forward. Vidar wore a special boot, made from all the leather scraps that cobblers had trimmed from shoes throughout history. With this boot, he would step on Fenrir's lower jaw, holding it down. Then he would reach up, grasp the wolf's upper jaw with his bare hands, and tear the beast's mouth apart, killing Fenrir in turn. After all the gods had fallen, after all the einherjar had perished, Surtur would swing his blazing sword and set the world aflame. The 9 realms would burn, Asgard would collapse, Midgard would sink into the sea. Everything that Odin and his brothers had created from Ymir's body would be destroyed, and the cosmos would return to the primordial chaos from which it had emerged. This was the fate that Odin knew awaited him. This was the future his wisdom had revealed, and yet he did not despair. He did not try to hide from it or deny it. Instead, he prepared. He gathered warriors. He forged alliances. He learned every scrap of magic and wisdom he could acquire. He made himself as powerful as possible, not because he believed he could change his fate, but because he would face that fate with everything he had. This response to inevitable doom reveals something profound about the Norse worldview and about Odin's character. The gods of Asgard knew they were mortal in a way that Greek gods or the god of Christianity were not. They could die. They would die. Ragnarok was not a possibility but a certainty, and yet this did not make them weak or pitiful. Instead, it made their choices meaningful. Knowing that you will fall does not eliminate the need to stand and fight. It makes the choice to do so more courageous, more defiant, more heroic. Odin embodied this tragic heroism. He was not a god of hope or salvation. He could not promise his followers that righteousness would be rewarded or that justice would ultimately prevail. What he offered instead was the chance to face the end with courage, to make your death mean something, to go down fighting rather than cowering. For a culture of warriors like the Vikings, this was perhaps more appealing than the promise of eternal life. Death with honor was better than life with shame. But Odin was not just a god of war and death. His pursuit of wisdom had made him something more complex, something that defied the usual categories of divine power. He was a master of magic, but not the straightforward magic of hurling lightning bolts or commanding the weather. Odin practiced Seder, a form of Norse magic that involved trance states, prophecy, and manipulation of fate itself. And this made him controversial, because Seder was considered women's magic, and for a male god to practice it was seen as ergi, a word that implied unmanliness or even sexual deviance. In the rigid gender roles of Viking society, there were things men did and things women did, and crossing these boundaries was dangerous. Men were warriors, using weapons and physical strength. Women were keepers of the home, but they were also the ones who practiced magic, who saw the future, who worked with herbs and charms and divination. For a man to do these things invited accusations of cowardice, of acting like a woman, of violating the natural order. And yet Odin did practice Seder. The sources are explicit about this. He learned it from Freya, the goddess who was mistress of this magic. He would fall into trances, send his spirit wandering while his body lay motionless, adopting the forms of animals, or traveling as pure consciousness to distant places. He would divine the future, using techniques associated with female vulvas. He would cast spells and work magic that warriors considered beneath their dignity. This made Odin a liminal figure, crossing boundaries that were normally forbidden. He was the king of the gods, the ultimate masculine authority, and yet he engaged in practices considered feminine. He was a war god, and yet he valued cunning over courage, winning through trickery rather than honest combat. He was the Allfather, the patriarch, and yet he would abandon his warriors mid-battle if he decided their time had come, showing no loyalty to those who had served him faithfully. These contradictions bothered some. The poem Lokasenna records a scene where Loki, in one of his truth-telling moods, accuses Odin of practicing cider on the island of Samso and says that this is an unmanly trait. Odin does not really deny the accusation. He accepts that he practices magic that others consider shameful, but he does not see this as a problem. To Odin, the pursuit of wisdom and power trumped concerns about propriety or honor. He would do whatever was necessary to gain knowledge, even if it meant violating social norms. This willingness to cross boundaries extended to Odin's relationships with other beings. He took multiple wives and consorts, producing children with goddesses, giantesses, and even mortal women. His primary wife was Frigg, queen of Asgard, mother of Baldur, a goddess of great wisdom in her own right. But he also had relationships with Jord, the earth personified, with whom he fathered Thor. He had sons with the giantesses Rinda and Grid. His many children included not just Thor, but also Baldur, Vidar, Vali, Bragi, Heimdall, Tyr, Hoder, and possibly others depending on the source. This promiscuity might seem inconsistent with being called the Allfather, but it actually makes sense in the context of Norse culture. Kings and chieftains often had multiple wives and concubines, and the more children they fathered, the more their line spread, the more alliances they could form. Odin's many children meant that many clans and royal houses could claim descent from him, could point to their divine lineage as proof of their right to rule. Half-giant Odin, producing quarter-giant children who then ruled among gods and men, created a web of relationships that tied together the different races and realms of the Norse cosmos. Odin's companions further revealed his complex nature. He had two ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory. Each morning, these birds flew out from Asgard to travel across all 9 realms, observing everything that happened. Each evening, they returned to Odin's shoulders and whispered in his ears all they had seen and heard. This gave Odin unparalleled knowledge of current events, of what was happening everywhere in the cosmos. But the sources mention that Odin feared something. He feared that one day Hugin or Munin might not return, that he might lose thought or memory. For a god whose power was based on knowledge and wisdom, the loss of these faculties would be a disaster worse than any physical defeat. This fear reveals a vulnerability in Odin, a recognition that even his mighty intellect could be threatened. He also had 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, both names meaning greedy or ravenous. These wolves accompanied Odin and ate the food that he himself did not consume. Wolves in Norse culture were ambiguous creatures. They were predators, dangerous, associated with death and violence. But they were also admired for their ferocity, their hunting skill, their loyalty to the pack. Odin's wolves represented the predatory aspects of his nature, the god who consumed heroes in battle, who demanded sacrifice, who was never satisfied in his hunger for power and knowledge. And then there was Sleipnir, Odin's horse. But Sleipnir was no ordinary horse. He had 8 legs and could run faster than any other mount, able to travel between the different worlds, to race across the sky, even to journey into the realm of the dead and return. Sleipnir's origin was bizarre even by the standards of Norse mythology. He was the offspring of Loki and a giant stallion. Loki had transformed himself into a mare to distract the stallion as part of a scheme involving the building of Asgard's walls. And he had ended up pregnant, later giving birth to the 8-legged foal that Odin claimed as his mount. Sleipnir represented Odin's shamanic nature. his ability to cross boundaries between worlds. Horses in many shamanic traditions are associated with spirit journeys, with the ability of the shaman's soul to travel to other realms. An 8-legged horse was even better, able to move in all directions, to traverse any terrain, to bridge any gap. When Odin rode Sleipnir, he could go anywhere in the cosmos, could appear suddenly in places no ordinary being could reach, could escape from danger that would trap others. All these companions and mounts reinforced Odin's role as a god who observed, who gathered knowledge, who moved freely between different realms and states of being. He was not a static ruler sitting on a throne, but an active explorer of the cosmos, constantly seeking new wisdom, new experiences, new understanding. And this brings us to one of Odin's most common manifestations, the Wanderer. Odin did not always remain in Asgard. In fact, the sources make clear that he spent much of his time traveling through the 9 realms, and particularly through Midgard, the world of humans. When he walked among mortals, he did not usually appear in his full divine glory. Instead, he disguised himself, taking the form of an old man, tall but stooped, with a long grey beard, and wearing a wide-brimmed hat or hood that shadowed his face, hiding his missing eye. He carried a walking staff that was actually Gungnir in disguise. He wore a dark cloak, often blue or grey, and travelled alone or with minimal company. In this guise, he went by many names: Grimnir, the Hooded One; Gangleri, the Wanderer; Harbard, Greybeard; Vegtam, the Wanderer on the Road; Sidgrani, Longbeard; Sidskeg, Droopbeard; Biliskeg, Wavering Beard. He appeared at the courts of kings, at the halls of farmers, at crossroads and borders, anywhere that travellers might pass. Sometimes he came to test people, to see if they would offer hospitality to a stranger. Hospitality was sacred in Norse culture. To turn away a traveller, to deny them food and shelter, was not just impolite, but a violation of cosmic law. Odin would appear as a poor old man and ask for a place by the fire, a meal, a bed for the night. Those who welcomed him generously, who treated him with respect despite his apparent poverty, earned his favour. Those who turned him away or treated him poorly found that they had just made a powerful enemy. Other times Odin came to observe, to learn, to gather information. He would sit at feasts and listen to the gossip and stories. He would engage people in conversation, particularly if they seemed wise or knowledgeable. He loved riddle contests and tests of wisdom, sometimes appearing at a king's hall and challenging the ruler to a competition of wits. These contests could be deadly. In the poem Vafthrudnismal, Odin visits the giant Vafthrudnir, and they exchange questions and answers, with the understanding that whoever fails to answer correctly will lose their head. Sometimes Odin's interventions in the mortal world were more direct. He would grant favors to heroes he admired, giving them magical weapons, offering advice, or intervening to save them from danger. But he could also be capricious, withdrawing his favor suddenly, causing heroes to fall at the moment of their greatest triumph. This inconsistency made him feared as much as revered. You could never fully trust Odin's support, because he might decide at any moment that he needed your death more than he needed your life, that you would serve him better as one of the einherjar than as a living warrior. The figure of Odin the Wanderer became a powerful symbol in Norse culture. Every old stranger at your door might be a disguised god testing your hospitality. Every wise elder you met on the road might be Allfather himself in disguise. This belief encouraged generosity and respect for travelers, but it also created an air of mystery and magic around the figure of the traveler. The world was not wholly mundane. The divine could break through at any moment. You had to be always alert, always generous, always prepared for the possibility that you were in the presence of power beyond your understanding. In many ways, Odin as the Wanderer embodied the same restless seeking that characterized his pursuit of wisdom. He could not be content to simply rule from Asgard. He had to go out, to experience, to observe, to engage with the world directly. His wisdom was not abstract philosophical knowledge, but practical understanding gained from countless interactions, countless journeys, countless experiences across the 9 realms. And all of this, all the sacrifices, all the wandering, all the accumulation of knowledge and power, was in preparation for the end he could not avoid, but would face with everything he had. The story of Odin ultimately is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy of a particular kind. It's not the tragedy of a hero brought low by a fatal flaw, not the fall from grace through pride or error. It's the tragedy of a being who sees the future, knows his doom is inescapable, and chooses to face it anyway, who sacrifices everything for wisdom, knowing that wisdom will not save him, who builds an army for a war he knows he will lose, who schemes and plans and manipulates fate, knowing that fate cannot ultimately be changed. This is why Odin resonates so powerfully even today. He's not a god who promises salvation or reward. He's not an all-powerful deity who controls everything and ensures justice prevails. He's a figure who embodies struggle against inevitable loss, who shows that meaning can be found not in victory, but in the choice to fight well, to face your end with courage and cunning and all the resources you can muster. The Vikings who worshipped Odin did not do so because they believed he would save them or grant them eternal life. They honored him because he represented their own values pushed to their ultimate extreme. The willingness to sacrifice for wisdom, the courage to face known danger, the cleverness to survive through cunning when strength wasn't enough, the determination to make your death mean something when death could not be avoided. After the Viking Age ended, after Christianity had spread across Scandinavia, and the old gods were no longer openly worshipped, Odin did not entirely disappear. He lived on in folklore, transformed into a leader of the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of dead souls that rode through the night sky in the winter months. He appeared in fairy tales and legends as a mysterious old man who tested heroes or granted magical gifts. His ravens became simply ravens, but their intelligence and their association with death and wisdom persisted in folk belief. In the modern era, Odin has experienced something of a renaissance. The scholarly study of Norse mythology in the 19th century brought him back into cultural consciousness. Writers and artists drew on these old stories, finding in them something that spoke to contemporary concerns. The composer Richard Wagner built his ring cycle around Norse myths, featuring Wotan, his version of Odin, as a central character. J.R.R. Tolkien, deeply influenced by Norse mythology, wove elements of Odin into his depiction of Gandalf, the wandering wizard who sacrifices himself and returns transformed. In recent decades, Odin has appeared in comic books, where Marvel's version of him plays a significant role in the Thor franchise, though this Odin bears only a loose resemblance to his mythological counterpart. He appears in video games, in fantasy novels, in TV shows, in countless reinterpretations and reimaginings. Some of these are more faithful to the sources than others, but all of them testify to the enduring fascination with this complex, contradictory, tragic figure. Modern neo-pagan movements, particularly those focused on reconstructing pre-Christian Germanic religious practices, have made Odin a central figure of worship once more. Asatru practitioners honor him as the Allfather, making offerings to him, meditating on his stories, seeking to embody the values he represents. These modern worshippers struggle with some of the same issues that bothered the ancient Norse. How do you honor a god who is admirable but not entirely trustworthy, powerful but not all-powerful, wise but not ultimately victorious? The answer, perhaps, is that Odin does not offer easy comfort. He demands sacrifice, effort, struggle. He represents the hard truth that wisdom is painful to acquire, that power comes at a cost, that knowing your fate does not mean you can change it. But he also offers dignity in the face of that truth, the chance to meet your end with courage rather than despair, the opportunity to make your choices matter, even when the outcome is already determined. Odin gave his eye for wisdom. He hanged himself for 9 days and nights to master the runes. He gathered an army for a war he knew he would lose. He faced the wolf that would devour him without flinching. In all of this, he showed that how you face the inevitable matters more than whether you can avoid it, that the pursuit of wisdom and power and meaning is worthwhile even if it cannot change the ultimate outcome, that there is a kind of victory in standing and fighting even when you know you will fall. This is the legacy of Odin, not comfort or salvation, but the example of how to live and die with purpose, with wisdom, with courage, the All-Father who sacrificed everything for knowledge, who crossed every boundary in pursuit of power, who knew his doom and faced it with his one eye open and clear. Before I go, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through the myths and mysteries of the Allfather. Odin's story is vast and complex, and we've only scratched the surface tonight. There are so many other tales we could explore, so many other aspects of his character to examine. The story of how he stole the mead of poetry, his relationship with his sons, particularly the tragic tale of Baldur's death, the complexities of the Aesir-Vanir war, and what it reveals about conflict and integration of different divine powers, his contests with giants and his dealings with dwarves. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Norse mythology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps us reach more people who love these ancient stories. Let me know in the comments what aspect of Odin's mythology most interests you, or what other figures from Norse mythology you'd like to explore in future videos. Should we talk about Thor next? Loki? Freya? The Norns? The giants? Let me know what calls to you. Until next time, may you seek wisdom worth the price, face your challenges with courage, and find meaning in the struggle. Good night, and sleep well.